This lecture will be long, around 2 hours most likely, so please take regular breaks. The lecture's split up into 5 sections which make natural resting points. The first 2 sections look at the structure of the party system until the passing of the First Reform Act of 1832, which was generally the start of democratic politics in the UK. And then the final 3 sections look at the emergence of the 3 main parties in the UK, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and then later the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party. So, like I said, there's a lot to cover here. What I want you to be able to do at the end of the presentation is to be able to apply modern theories of party systems to past changes, as well as understand how parties respond to sudden changes in political contexts. Also, how one party might go about displacing another party within a party system, especially under a first-past-the-post system. This lecture also serves to give people who might not have studied British party politics before a bit of a background, but if you don't really know anything about politics since before 2010, it is definitely worth reading a book. Well, it's probably worth reading a fair few books. The one I recommend, though, as a good introduction that might cover broad bases but is also quite interesting, is Simon Jenkins' A Short History of England, 2011. It's quite fun, so well worth reading. All right, slide 3. So this is the first section, proto-parties in the Stuart era. The Stuart era ran from 1603 to 1714, and we'll pretty much start from the restoration of the monarchy in 1659, definitely not 1959. Now, until about the 19th century, party politics was seen as bad. It was seen as something to be avoided. And for most of the politicians, most of the time that we'll be looking at, they rejected party labels. They did not see themselves as part of political parties, even if they were. They would reject that. So politics was best understood as factional, conducted amongst groups of men, and they were all men, who were linked by family allegiances or broadly similar views on the big issues of the day. I've used the term factions instead of parties now because I want to impress the fact that these are not political parties as we know them today. There was no institutionalisation. There was no membership. Organisation often involved drinking in the same club in London, being from the same family or same part of the country, and there was no sense that these factions, competed really in any cohesive sense on common specific policy goals in order to win an election and thus enter government. The ability or the concept of political parties contesting an election and then the winner going on to form a government as a party as a whole was very late in terms of the development of the British Constitution, and we'll cover that. As Jeremy Black states in his study on politics in the early 18th century, in England, 18th century political parties tended to lack an identifiable national leadership, an organised constituent membership, and a recognised corpus of policy and principle around which to cohere and which could serve to link local activists to national activity. And that's from Black 1990, page 89. So why am I saying this now? Well, for clarity. Throughout this, I'll probably say party when it wouldn't meet the definition of a party in the modern sense. But at the time, it's to get at the idea that there was something more than just a group of independents who turned up and voted. They were people who did sometimes act in a cohesive manner in some areas, some of the time. But also, it's for you to consider whether you agree with folks like Schatzinger, who claimed that modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties, or Rossiter, who exuberantly stated that there was no America without democracy, no democracy without politics, and no politics without parties. These people really put parties at the core of what they think a modern democratic state should look like, and the pre-reform era might show alternatives. So this is all just something to think about. So the beginnings of a party system in the Stuart era. The English Civil War, part of broader British Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, led to the overthrow of the monarchy. It pitted royalists against parliamentarians based on deep disagreements over how England should be governed, the role of the rights of the king, and how taxation should be levied. Royalists claimed rule by absolute monarchy and the principle of the divine right of kings. So, for example, Charles I should not have to seek permission from Parliament to raise taxes. Parliamentarians, on the other hand, supported the right of Parliament to have ultimate control over the monarch and the executive branch of government. Most supported constitutional monarchy, but some supported republicanism, including Oliver Cromwell. By the end of the Civil War, it ended with a parliamentarian victory, and at that point, so many parliamentarians were so annoyed at the Crown that they were willing to support a republic. So in 1649, Charles I was tried and executed. His son, Charles II, was exiled in 1651, and the English monarchy was replaced with, at first, Commonwealth of England, and then the Protectorate under the personal rule of Oliver Cromwell, and then briefly his son, Richard, for a year. So we go from a monarchy to a very secular monarchy, essentially. Now, when the Protectorate failed under Richard Cromwell, Parliament restored Charles II as monarch and handily backdated his rule to the date of his father's death as if nothing ever happened. However, we get a problem. King Charles II was a Protestant with Catholic sympathies. The heir, James, Duke of York, was discovered to be a Catholic, and it was feared that he would rule in a similar way to the absolutist Catholic rulers of France. So, a bill was moved in Parliament, the Exclusion Bill, James, Duke of York, from the succession on the basis of his religion. Now, 3 attempts were made at this, and it crystallised MPs into two parties, in inverted brackets, commas, the Whigs and the Tories. Slide 5, the exclusion crisis and forms of political expression. So, last week we spoke about cleavages and how they require political actors to mobilise along them in order to become politically salient. The exclusion crisis represented a new political cleavage with MPs. Of course, this was pre-democratisation. There was no need to really mobilise the bulk of citizens, although many would have had strong opinions on the topic anyway. Those who supported the Exclusion Bill came to be known as Whigs, who primarily feared James, Duke of York's desire for absolute monarchy, his connections to France, and feared that his ascension to the throne would damage the rights of Protestants. Those who opposed the Exclusion Bill came to be known as Tories, who supported the right of James to succeed his brother. They were also known as Jacobites because Jacobus was the Latin version of James, so that's quite fancy. The Tories also feared that by interfering in the succession, they were going against the divine right, they were going against God. And that was quite a serious thing at the time. Now, Jones argues that there were strong elements of continuity between the parties, the Tories and the Whigs, in the sides of the Civil War. So Whigs and the parliamentarians were linked, and Tories and the Royalists were linked. And this is unsurprising, given they had a common ideological thread vis-a-vis views of the authority of the Crown and of Parliament. Undeniably, Whigs were much better organised than their Tory counterpart. As Harris notes, the Whigs had political clubs to coordinate tactics and strategy. They employed electoral agents, orchestrated a highly sophisticated propaganda campaign, deployed a wide range of visual, oral and printed media, and sought to mobilise the populace nationwide to support their platform through mass petition campaigns and political rallies. That's quite extensive. Whilst the Tories mimicked many of the Whigs' organisational and propaganda techniques, around a platform of commitment to the existing settlement in church and state and opposition to Protestant nonconformists. And this leads Harris to conclude that if political parties are understood as organised groupings of people with mass followings that are united in the promotion of a series of principles that were intended for the public good, then both the Whigs and the Tories of that time would qualify. Now, Clarke disagrees. He says parties existed in the Commons during the exclusion crisis, but in an elementary form. Only the Whigs evolved anything like a party organisation before 1688. The Tories were still the King's personal followers. So to all intents and purposes, the debate is still alive, but we're looking at broad patterns, not historical squabbles. And what we see here is the emergence of groups of men with common political purposes, close enough to a party. So the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was very important. Charles II died in 1685 and was replaced by James, who only lasted on the throne for 3 years. He had a son who was also called James, And this threatened to create a Roman Catholic dynasty in the UK, which would rule over Protestant Britain. Before then, it was assumed that James's Protestant daughter, Mary, would take the throne along with her husband, William of Orange. Simon Jenkins describes this as a disaster for Protestant England, and led to all sides, Whig, Tory, Anglican and Nonconformist, combining to prevent a Catholic succession and what seemed like the certainty of resumed civil war. That's from Jenkins, 2011, page 155. Now, this led to Whig leaders inviting James II Protestant daughter Mary and her husband to be co-rulers of England, Scotland and Ireland. This was a largely conflict-free revolution following James II's decision to flee the country, and so it's known as the Glorious Revolution. As Corwood and Gaunt note, William's moderate public declarations encouraged the defection to his side of Tory as well as Whig magnates in a remarkable illustration of the extent to which James's Catholic policies had united the Protestants against him. The widespread dissatisfaction amongst Whig and Tories with James's policies should not be played down. That's Corwood and Gaunt, 2017, page 387. And so many Tories accepted the outcome of the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary's right to rule, whilst a small chunk, and we're talking about small Tories, still supported the idea of the divine right of kings, and thus James II's right to rule. These became known as Jacobites, although historically the term was also used as a slur against more moderate Tories too, because it's effective. This divide was so great as to destroy the inner coherence of the Tories as a group, according to Clarke. And so, putting this in today's language, we have the original cleavage between, say, Whig and Tories, but then we also have a cross-cutting cleavage within the Tory section, or the Tory straddle, about the role of Jacobite policies, should James II really be seen as the true king. So the Glorious Revolution creates a cross-cutting cleavage within the Tory party, and this is damaging. But the size of the Jacobite grouping was very small, so the Tories could still continue as one side of the divide with the Whigs. So the broader Whig-Tory division continued under William and Mary. The Whigs had the upper hand, right? They were wary of seeing the power of the crown grow, whilst the Tories were opposed to financing William's wars abroad. And Clarke argued that the Parliament of 1690 to 1695, the first under William and Mary, saw parties polarised anew. Whig and Tory came to embody policy preferences towards more and more political options, but it's not to say that they were well organised or the party as an institution constituted the basis of either government or opposition, despite an increasing tendency for it to do both. And what this means is that these groupings were important. They were clusters of people who shared a common ideology, but parties didn't fulfil some of the functions they do today, such as providing a government or opposition. So, for example, it's up to the Crown, up to the King Queen, to decide who forms their government, and they might ask a Whig leader, but that Whig would not be expected to just choose certain Whigs, and also it's not the leader of the Whigs, if there was one, who could expect to be picked. That choice resided with the Crown. So the Crown could choose a Tory and ask him to be led by, or to have Whigs in the cabinet. Parties do not structure this element of competition for government office. However, other interests also dominated politics. The Whigs and the Tories were also split between the court party, those whose careers or interests revolved around the court in London, and what became known as the country party, those who opposed the court and sought to limit court power. This split both Tory and Whig factions, and a good parallel to today might be Leave Remain, splitting the Conservatives and, to a lesser extent, Labour. It's important not to over-egg the court-country dichotomy at this point, but it was an important cross-cutting cleavage. It could be considered. Following the death of William, James II's daughter Anne, a staunch Protestant, was crowned. During her reign, parties reached a high tide of importance. An examination of voting records show that from the mid-1690s through the reign of Anne, most peers and members of Parliament voted consistently along party lines, and whilst voters rarely split their votes between Whigs and Tories, they tended to back one party, and it seemed that these party labels mattered. It's from Harris, 2020. This is partly due to the Triennial Act, passed in 1694, which ensured the Parliament met annually and had to hold elections every 3 years. In reality, they were held every 2.5 years on average. I couldn't actually find, and this is probably quite embarrassing for someone who likes to research political history, but I couldn't find the maximum duration of a parliament or how long elections had to be called after before this. So if you know, please let me know, because I'd be really interested. But it was nowhere near 3 years. So these elections gave greater prominence to party leaders and labels, and unintentionally gave life to party conflict. That's from the Encyclopaedia Britannica. So Anne was more minded to support the Tories. She distrusted the Whigs, who she blamed for removing her father from the throne, although she found herself having to rely on them more and more, giving the Tories disastrous results in the 1708 general election. Anne died in 1714, and the crown passed to George I, the first of the Hanoverian kings, called Hanoverian because they were from Hanover area. However, under Anne, studies have been successful in demonstrating the primacy of the Whig-Tory party divide in every aspect of politics, according to Thomas, 1987. First, foreign policy. The Tories wanted to focus on trade and shipping, global Britain, if you will, and the Whigs wanted war with France and its absolutist Catholic monarchy. Religious tolerance. Whigs were favourable to dissenters and toleration, and Tories supported the established Anglican Church. Thirdly, the Glorious Revolution and the relative power of the Crown and Parliament. The Whigs still stood for Parliament's right to determine the succession to the throne. However, most Tories were prepared to accept the Hanoverian succession of 1714, and only a few were loyal Jacobites. So, there was a party system. The strengthening of the Tory and Whig factions, ebbing and flowing based on circumstances and electoral context. Many powerful, active politicians had no party label, however, and government did not require support from a single party to survive. Ad hoc but stable coalitions could be based around individual interests and personal links. So, we have a situation whereby parties did matter, but they were not the all-important method of organising political competition that they are today. We'll finish this section with this argument from Thomas. From the Restoration to the start of the Georgian period, the political scene was one in which two broad Whig and Tory alignments confronted each other. But they were precisely that, coalitions of groups and individuals, not monolithic parties. That's Thomas, 1987, 2008, page 208. I find this all really interesting. I hope you do too. So in this second section, we'll be looking at British political parties in the Georgian era. That is from 1714 to 1837, when Britain was ruled by the Hanoverian kings George I, George II, George III, George IV, and, you guessed it, William IV. A number of key changes occurred during this period. We see the first Prime Minister in Robert Walpole, the erosion of any semblance of a Tory party, and the complete dominance of the Whigs. We call this period the Whig supremacy. Tories were effectively banned from holding political or public office, and so nearly every political figure called themselves a Whig. However, the Tories survived as a rump opposition in the Commons, but again, they didn't organise as a party, but they didn't split off and join the Whigs in any great numbers, and we'll look at why that is. So for this period, pretty much anybody who is anybody calls themselves a Whig. And the period ends with the creation of the Conservative Party under Sir Robert Peel, and by the end of this era, we see political parties in broadly the way we understand them to be today. So, as we covered in the previous slides, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 removed James II from the throne of England, Scotland and Ireland and replaced him with his Protestant daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William of Orange. Queen Anne succeeded them, but had no surviving children, and thus the Stuart line ended. The 1701 Act of Settlement excluded Catholics from the throne, thus ensuring the monarch would always be a Protestant. This led to the Hanoverian George I to take the throne, following Anne's death, a distant relation unlike Anne's Catholic half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart. The Whigs were pro-Hanoverian and they supported George I, and he favoured the Whigs, bringing in an overwhelmingly Whig government when he arrived in England. Despite this, most Tories supported George's succession to the throne. As Williams notes, not William the King, the Glorious Revolution itself was quite as much the work of high-flying church Tories who for their religious security under a Roman Catholic king, whilst the Act of Settlement itself was passed by a Tory majority. That's from Williams and Stuart, 1962. Many Tories had made their peace with the post-Glorious Revolution settlement. However, as Zaleski notes, there were extreme elements from within the Tory ranks who were Jacobites. They originally supported James II's claim to the throne and that of his descendants, including James Francis Edward. Those Jacobite Tories took the concept of divine right of kings very seriously. As Williams notes, a number of Tory squires and high Anglicans believed that adequate safeguards for their religion could be secured from James and were convinced that in breaking the legitimate line they would commit a deadly sin. Now this was limited. There was limited support for the Jacobite cause. The most important supporter was the Tory Lord Bolingbroke, the leader of the Tories under Queen Anne, who was snubbed by George I. His involvement with the Jacobites tainted the Tory partyism for the next half-century and, broadly, led to the proscription of the Tories from political office. Now you can find out more about the proscription of the Tories through the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The Jacobite uprising of 1715 was supported by France, but was quickly defeated by the government, and the election afterwards after the uprising saw the Tories trounced for their supposed Jacobite sympathies, and the Whigs returned to power with a majority of around 150, and that's from Simon Jenkins. Following the Jacobite uprising, George I removed the remaining Tories from government, and for the first time, the ministry was composed solely of Whigs. This was the beginning of the Whig supremacy and the proscription, i.e. banning, of Tories from political office, which would last from 1714 to 1760. Indeed, the proved involvement of a small number of Tory landowners in the Jacobite uprising led to the Tories being purged not only from state office, but also the higher ranks of the army and navy, the diplomatic service, and the judicial system. And that's from the Encyclopaedia Britannica 2020. George I also had political disagreements with the Tories, who were less supportive of his foreign wars and more opposed to religious toleration, thus he much preferred to work with the Whigs anyway. The new Whig government replaced the Triennial Act with the Septennial Act, which meant a general election had to be held every 7 years instead of every 3 years. And this was because regular elections had produced political volatility. And during Anne's reign, the electorate had shown itself to be volatile and far more inclined to vote Tory than Whig. And of course, we can't be having that. The effect of this was to dampen down party politics, to reduce the importance of political labels and party groupings. So in 1717, we see the first fracturing of the Whigs, partly for personal reasons, but chiefly owing to differences on foreign policy. The Whigs who were rejected from government went into opposition and rallied around George, the Prince of Wales, and who was the future George II. This split in the Whigs was patched up by 1720, but it shows you how extreme these movements were. The parties were not solid units that could withstand quite a lot of tension like they are today. They were much more fluid. Interestingly, if anything, the split in the Whigs didn't actually harm the Whigs. If anything, it strengthened it. As Williams explains, hitherto, the King's choice of alternate ministers to the Whigs had been limited to Tories, many of them tainted by Jacobitism. Now, there were ministers out of office as Whig and as devoted to the dynasty as those in office. So, the King government Whigs or opposition Whigs, and ignore the Tories completely, instead of having to choose between government Whigs and opposition Tories. This meant that however opposed the opposition Whigs were to government policy, they were still loyal to the King and the Hanoverian dynasty, and so the King could choose between his Whig ministry or a Whig opposition. Meanwhile, opposition Whigs could work with the Tories when it suited them, but did not need to rely on their support to get into government. Williams credits this with the creation of the practice of loyal opposition, a key concept in the British Constitution and a glue which binds party politics to the state, especially when a party is in opposition. Clarke agrees, arguing that the years of 1714 to 54 therefore saw a 2 or 3 party system, with party established as the legitimate basis of government but not of opposition. Opposition as an institution was not legitimised by the institution of party. So opposition would shape government but not opposition. Now this video is not the place to get to the ins and outs of the court of George I and II, but we should be aware that there is a debate on the extent to which the Tories survived as a political grouping, as a party in this period. The traditional view is that after 1714 there was an absence of a significant Tory party due to a lack of issues to rally around and of a lack of political leadership. For these proponents, such as Thomas, it is wrong to speak of a Tory party in any meaningful sense. Instead, of those Tories in the Commons, the majority simply formed a permanent opposition to government, and surviving Tories were backbench members who were divided amongst themselves. Tory and Whig became less of a party label and more of a signal of one's views on the relationship between the Crown and Parliament. Ergo, there was as much difference and disagreement within the Whigs as there was between Whig and Tory, unless it was around this central question of Crown and Parliament. However, so actually, instead for these traditionalist historians, the term administration and opposition were used to describe the parliamentary scene rather than any party labels. However, revisionist scholars such as Clarke and Jeremy Black argue that the Tory party was more cohesive than a traditionalist view, and instead we should think of the party system as administration Whig, opposition Whig and Tories. And so you have kind of two cleavages here. You have the cleavage between the view on the role of Crown and Parliament, which gives the Whig Tories, but you also have a cleavage based within the Whigs on government policy. So Black also notes how key Whig figures would write about how very few Tories would betray their value and join Whig administrations, further suggesting an element of loyalty and cohesion in Parliament. And some divisionalists in Hansard on Parliament even make a distinction between opposition Whigs and Tories. So regardless of whether the Tories were a party or not, and I think they were, the ministry was always run by Whigs. Under George I and George II, 46 years between them, for 21 of those 46 years the ministry was run by one man, Sir Robert Walpole. Walpole became Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1721, and if you look on his Wikipedia page, or more official websites, he is credited as being Britain's first Prime Minister, a title which was commonly used as a mocking slur. It wasn't until the 20th century that the title was used officially, and Walpole's policy was dictated by the avoidance of war and the pride, and Walpole's peace came to be regarded as a golden age. You can read more about this in Jenkins 2011. When George I died in 1727, George II kept Walpole in position, largely due to Walpole's friendship with Queen Caroline. George II ensured the peers and bishops appointed were Walpole's supporters, so this meant the conflict that Walpole did have was concentrated in the Commons. It was not long until Walpole met opposition, although not from the largely irrelevant Tories, but instead from within his own party. When Walpole dismissed William Pulteney from office in 1725, he joined with 17 others to form the Patriot Whigs. And although both the Patriot Whigs and the Tories were in opposition, they had frequent disagreements which Walpole used to his own advantage in a sort of divide and conquer manner. As time went on, Walpole became more unpopular. The size of the Patriot Whigs increased in each general election while Walpole was still Prime Minister, as shown in the table. Over time, those in the Tory ranks also became split between those who wanted to enter a coalition with the Patriot Whigs and those who did not. Furthermore, many Tories were outraged by their proscription and were pushed into Jacobitism. When James II's son, James Francis, wrote to the Tories and asked them to oppose the government wherever possible, they redeveloped some organisational strength, but this was hardly consistent. Robert Walpole resigned over issues with the war with Spain and views that he was personally enriching himself in office. Thus, in 1742, Robert Walpole lost a vote of confidence in his government by one vote, Walpole felt he had lost the support of Parliament and thus felt he had to resign. Beginning the convention, the Prime Ministers needed the support of the House of Commons to remain in office, not just the support of the King. However, at this point, the principle of collective cabinet responsibility had not been established, and other members of the Walpole ministry remained in office. By the end of Walpole's time as PM, a new type of party system had emerged. The administration was formed by Whigs, but the opposition was not party-based per se. Patriot Whigs often worked with Tory MPs who were broadly grouped into Hanoverian Tories, the majority, and Jacobite Tories. These various groups worked together in key areas under a broad banner of the country platform, who saw themselves supporting the interests of the whole country rather than the court, politicians in power in London. So, in this era, while all court politicians were Whigs, not all Whigs were court politicians, and while all Jacobites were Tories, not all Tories were Jacobites. I've made these, well, I think they're fun, these graphics that help kind of contextualise this. And you can see the difference by the start of Walpole's premiership and the end of George II's reign in 1760. So public dissatisfaction with a Whig political elite was coupled with changes in the geopolitical structure in Europe. Britain's involvement in the War of the Austrian Succession pitted it against France, with whom the country had been at peace since 1713. Now, France was once again willing to support the Jacobite pretender James Francis against George II. James Francis's eldest son, Charles Edward Stuart, landed in Scotland in 1745, but when he marched from Scotland to Derby, no Tory landowner or politician joined him, nor did any men of influence or wealth come out in his favour, and in 1746 the Jacobean uprising was defeated. Now, despite the lack of Tory support for the revolution or for the attempted invasion, the invasion was electorally damaging for the Tories. The Tory prescription stayed in place, and now that Walpole was out of the picture, many of the Tories' Patriot Whig allies wanted nothing more to do with Tories or Tory measures. In the first election after the Jacobite uprising, many Patriot Whigs rejoined the administration Whigs, but nearly 100 remained in opposition. There were still almost as many Whigs in opposition to the Whig administration than there were Tories. For the rest of George II's reign, the party system stayed broadly the same. The Patriot Whigs were slowly reabsorbed into the administration Whigs, and Whig factions would be based on family connections. The Tories also suffered, given by the fact that at the end of George II's reign, Jacobitism was virtually extinct, and the political importance was muted. Instead, Tories were happy to sit in opposition. So, how did the Tories survive proscription? So, during this period of the mid-17th century, even the mention of parties is broadly incorrect, or at least is seen as incorrect. As Brooke notes, it was universally recognised that around 1754, near the end of George II's reign, denominations of Whig and Tory no longer corresponded to political realities, and that issues which formerly distinguished them were dead. Furthermore, there were no party organisations in this time. Some Whigs were organised around the Treasury, i.e. the court, but there was no organisation independent of court or state. For the Tories, insofar as any organisation at all is to be found in their ranks, grouped themselves on a regional basis, and there was little intercourse between the Tories of Devon and Cornwall and those of the Midland counties. With such flimsy organisation to support them, it is no wonder parties crumbled and disintegrated. Now, Brooke does argue that something intangible remained, unaffected by the dissolution of the two old parties. Political ideas survived without the protection of party organisations and took root in strange and wonderful places. And that's Brooke, 1964. And so what ideological groupings of individuals that are fleeting, they're not institutionalised like political parties today are. And so this whole area, the Whig supremacy, is contested. The role of parties is contested, and the extent to which there were groupings. But I think it's safe to say we were somewhere in between a parliament of or a commons of complete independence and the highly centralised parties we see today, the highly cohesive parties we see today. In my mind, it seems to me that we did have groupings of MPs who had broadly similar interests and often would act on those interests, but we're probably not at the point where they could be known as parties in any kind of self-identity sense. This is something that we've projected back onto these groups of people in order to construct a broad strain, a golden thread that runs from the end of the Civil War to today. So we can say there were Whigs and Tories, then there were Conservatives, Whigs, Radicals, then there were Conservatives and Liberals, then there was Liberal, Conservatives and Labour. We want to draw that long thread, but that's not really necessarily the case. Now, it's worth considering how the Tories survived as a grouping, even if we accept Brooke's arguments of regional grouping during the Whig supremacy. Many parties or organisations would have fractured, slowly eroded, but the Tories didn't. Why? Well, for most of the period, the Tories commanded a broad base of support in rural England, but the undemocratic nature of the franchise and the maldistribution of borough seats ensured that this popular appeal was never translated into a Tory majority in Parliament. Cruikshanks finds that the Tories would have won every single general election between 1715 and 1747, so for the bulk of the prescription, had the number of seats corresponded to the number of votes cast. So, the electoral system here did not translate votes into seats in any kind of fair or effective way for the Tories, but they could maintain that base of support. The effects of prescription and the rigid party system ironically made a cohesive force. The Whigs offered very few opportunities for Tories who switched sides. So as a grouping, there was the cost-benefit analysis essentially for any Tory looking to defect was all cost, i.e. you would lose the current links that you had with Tories, but there would be no benefit, you'd have no guarantee, it'd be very hard for you to be put into office as a new Whig. So that kept the least worst option was to stay as a Tory. So individual Tories had very little temptation to defect because there would be no benefit. And throughout the module, we'll see how these factors, the role of the electoral system, political incentives, and the behaviour of other parties, are still relevant to party politics today. Now, it was not until 1760, with the ascension of George III to the throne, that the Tories were brought back into the administration. Their prescription was over, but it didn't mean they were a cohesive political force again. According to Sedgwick, the state of affairs lasted until the emergence of new issues. Electoral reform led to a revival of two-party system, in which the ministerial side gradually assumed the name of Tory, leaving the Whigs to their opponents in opposition. Now that's Sedgwick, 1970. What he essentially means there is, without new issues to reanimate the party system and to give meaning to groups, the incentives for these parties to realign themselves or to build themselves back up was limited. And arguably, it's not until after the Great Reform Act of 1832, or slightly before that with the issue of Catholic emancipation and the Tories' opposition to it, that we see this grouping occur. We also see the issue of American Revolution, the French Revolution, brings some Whigs over, like Edmund Burke, for example, from the Whig side to the Tory side. So the role of issues and new cleavages is much more important in reshaping parties in this era than just kind of government fiat. Or George III hoped to break the Whig leadership's power over Parliament by appointing Lord Bute as Prime Minister and bypassing the traditional Whig leadership in the hope of becoming a more activist king. Now, like all historical claims, the role of party politics in this period under George III is heavily debated. The general consensus does seem to be that both the Tory and Whig ceased to operate as parties. Now, Clarke argues that the history of the Tory party in Parliament between the early 1760s and the late 1820s may be simply written. It did not exist. Thomas argues any remaining Tories in Parliament were backbench members divided amongst themselves. And Dickinson agrees, stating all historians are agreed the Tory party declined sharply by the late 1740s and 1750s, and it ceased to be an organised party by 1760. There were no organisational parties in Parliament between the late 1750s and the early 1780s. Even the Whigs ceased to be an identifiable party, and Parliament was dominated by competing political connections, which all proclaim Whiggish political views, or by independent backbenchers unattached to any particular group. So what existed under George III were not two parties, but two sides in Parliament, administration and opposition. A core party of office holders, independent MPs and political factions as the basic structure of parliamentary politics in the late 18th century. So that's from Thomas, 1987, page 207. In politics, the term Tory was an unfriendly epitaph for those who were seen to be close to the king, but as mentioned, all of these politicians considered themselves Whigs. Thomas found that between 1768 and 1774, not a single politician labelled themselves a Tory, which is a bit like Liverpool City Council. And yet, if we look on Wikipedia panels for Lord Bute and Lord North, both are described as Tories. So, again, this is our attempt to project back a desire to argue that modern political parties or the party politics structured this time period when contemporaries at the time were saying that it didn't. We're trying to apply a party system to this era when it might simply not exist, or at least not exist as a party system we would know today. So instead of parties, what we had were family groupings. As Zaleski argues, no Whig party as such existed at this time, only a series of aristocratic groups and family connections operating in Parliament through patronage and influence. Nor was the only Tory sentiment, tradition and temperament surviving among certain families and social groups. The administration was formed from so-called King's Friends, which sounds a bit like a euphemism. For example, ministers under Lord North were drawn from Whig and Tory traditions and MPs who fell into neither category. Political party was not organising Parliament at this time. Period. In some ways, the Whig groupings could be seen as parties. So we can think of, for example, talking about modern ideas today, in Switzerland, for example, or Belgium, where you might have an overarching ideology, for example, let's say social democracy or environmentalism, you can have parties within that ideology competing. We might look at the political system, or at least the Commons and the House of Lords at this time, with an overarching Whig ideology and then competing parties within that ideology that we all just label Whigs. So there were clear groupings, they were broadly loyal to one another, and they had consistent ideologies. Indeed, these groupings saw themselves as parties and were viewed by parties by others, or at least factions, but parties is probably a safe bet. For example, the Bedford Whigs forced George III to accept them into office as a party, not as individuals, and Powell argues that though a smaller group than the Rockinghams, the Bedfords certainly acted as a party and practiced collective resignation. In many ways, they were much better organised as a party than their opponents. To cap this off, Duncan notes how in the 1770s contemporaries were saying the distinction of Whig and Tory no longer existed in England. It's now the Bootian Party, the Bedford Party, the Chatham Party, the Rockingham Party, the Shelburne Party, etc., etc., amongst whom the present contest is for power. That's from Duncan, 2015. So when it comes to the Tories, the fact that a member was classed as a Tory in 1754 or 1761 is no guide to what his subsequent conduct would be, or what attitude he would take when the American problem, that is, the build-up and conduct of the American Revolution, came before Parliament. For Tories were essentially independents, and once Toryism as a political creed has lost its raison d'etre, there was no party organisation to keep the Tories together. All of the various parties of the late 1760s had sprinklings of former Tories among them. Brooke, 1964. So, what we have is the complete breakdown under George III of the old dichotomy of Whig and Tories. Those who might have had Tory ideas under the prescription or earlier, well, that meant nothing now. The whole thing was up in the air under this broadly Whig ideology and complete absence of any kind of Jacobite antipathy towards the government. So even in this period, and even amongst those who were generally considered to belong to parties, they denounced party as an unhealthy element in political life. In 1784, just as in 1754, the politicians professed to decry party and to wish for an administration formed from the best of all parties. Brooke, 1964, really good resource if you're interested in this. If By the 1760s and 70s, Whig and Tory were terms that had lost precise ideological significance, and the breakdown of these old partisan decisions undoubtedly contributed to ministerial instability. Under William Pitt the Younger and Charles James Fox, a clearer two-party system would emerge, even if the term Tory was still not used self-consciously. So, in 1783, George III asked William Pitt the Younger to become Prime Minister at the age of 24. That is 3 years younger than me, and is making me rethink most of my life decisions. Britain's defeat in the American Revolution. Pitt called himself an independent Whig, but historians often label him as a Tory. He was attuned to scientific innovation and the mercantilism of the Industrial Revolution, an enthusiast for the ideas of Adam Smith, and understood the damage that ill-judged wars could wreak on the nation's finance. Like him too, he dreaded European entanglements and saw his duty as to promote sound finance at home and profitable trade abroad. Simon Jenkins, 2011, page 179. The nature of Pitt's appointment and the clear fact that he enjoyed the King's support invigorated the Whiggish opposition under Charles James Fox. 2 days before Pitt was appointed Prime Minister, Fox declared in the House of Commons that if a change must take place and a new ministry is to be formed and supported, not by the confidence of this House or the public, but the sole authority of the Crown, I, for one, shall not envy that honourable gentleman his situation. For that moment I put my claim for a monopoly of Whig principles. Again, saying that if you get your office through the Crown, you're just a Tory, you can't call yourself a Whig. Thus, Whigs felt able to use the slur Tory against Pitt due to his closeness and reliance upon the Crown. The Whigs became better organised as well around Fox, opening a Whig club, but no Tory club was opened in response. Only one member in the 1754 to 90 period labelled themselves a Tory, though. Contemporaries simply did not see Tory as a label for a party. Regardless of labels, however, there were two broad groups that we would consider rudimentary parties. Pitt's Tories, according to Zaleski, broadly represented the interests of the country gentry, the merchant class, and official administerial groups. In opposition, a revived Whig party, led by Charles James Fox, came to represent the interests of religious dissenters, industrialists, and others who sought an electoral, parliamentary, and philanthropic reforms. As noted, however, Pitt himself did not see his position of that as a leader of a party, but instead as a servant of the House and of the Crown, or at least his position was secured by the Crown, not by a body of men who he led in a party. Or, as Clarke puts it, so far as government sympathisers in the Commons were organised, it was by treasury, not party organisation. The coherence of Pitt's top politicians came from administrative, not a party ethic. Furthermore, the bulk of Pitt's support in the Commons came from MPs who would have supported any generally popular PM. So, we have the broad outlines of what on the surface looks like a two-party system, but it's not really a two-party system. It's, on the Whig side, more of a party, closer to what we'd expect today, but on the Pittite side, it's more of a technocratic, almost, government supported by the Crown. So Crown v Whig, almost. The point of this is maybe to show the futility of trying to project back current views of the party system, but it's also to show, just to show how weird and fuzzy things were compared to what we expect the political system to run like under party government, and also to show alternative or potential alternative ways of doing so. So, when Pitt died in 1806, his followers went into opposition as Pittites, or Friends of Mr. Pitt, and increasingly behaved like a party, adopting a degree of organisational unity before assuming office in 1807. Duncan notes, so that's from Duncan 2015, page 9, Duncan notes, right of politics, there were various factions around prominent figures, but these had all but disappeared by the time of Lord Liverpool's administration, which was 1812 to 1827. And for Duncan, this was a key period of consolidation in which the semblance of a two-party system emerged, i.e. Tory and Whig. Now, indeed, instead of relying on a mix of Tory and Whig support, Liverpool's government presided over a broad Tory working alliance. you can find more information about this on the historyofparliamentonline.org website. If you go to the 1820 to 1832 section and look at the politics and parties. This, though, is disputed by Clark, who argues that the Liverpool ministry was organised as a non-party government running on an ethic of administrative experience rather than polarised political ideologies. And also Liverpool refused to use the Tory label too, like today. So what we essentially have is an opposition Whig party, and either, if you follow Duncan's line of thought, a more self-consciously Tory but not using the name Tory party, or do you have Whig versus technocrat, or Whig versus like Treasury administrative party? In 1827, Lord Liverpool had a stroke. His replacement, the Tory Canning, died in office after 119 days. But again, in the Commons, Canning justified his ministry based on non-party judgments, instead administrative prowess. And then we get the Tory Duke of Wellington, who became Prime Minister. In 1829, he supported and passed Catholic emancipation. Now, this split this kind of Tory coalition between the reformist Canningites and the ultra-Tories who opposed Catholic emancipation. And although he won the 1830 general election, he lost a vote of confidence and had to resign over his unwillingness to reform the electoral system or expand suffrage. He was replaced by the Whig Earl Grey. Now, yes, like the tea. So Lord Liverpool was quite effective at keeping various factions within the Tories together, and it was only after he died that the Tories split between the more conservative ultra Tories and the more liberal Canningites who refused to serve under the Duke of Wellington. So what we see here again is a common ideological position within, under a kind of leader, Lord Liverpool, bringing together people who would have a shared understanding of ideology that we can label Tory. But that is not completely the whole story, because the role of personality in keeping these parties together is also paramount, and you can see that with the split after his death. So that kind of brings us up to the Great Reform Act. So, like I say, the Lord Liverpool's government was replaced by the Whig Earl Grey, not through any talent really on the part of Earl Grey, but rather the splits in the Tories themselves. But the Whigs had been out of power since a long struggle. Grey managed to get the Reform Act 1832 passed. It reduced the number of rotten boroughs, gave parliamentary representation to cities, expanded the property qualification for voting, and created a more uniform franchise in the boroughs. Again, Simon Jenkins's book is great to read on this. In the general election, following the Reform Act, Grey's Whigs were rewarded, and they won roughly 2/3 of the vote and the seats. The combined issues of Catholic emancipation and the Great Reform Act, according to Clark, not only shattered the old groupings, recombined their components in new patterns, and made obsolete many of the political issues of the 1920s, it also destroyed party political perspectives on past events. So, the Conservative and Liberal parties of the 1830s onward took on new identities, new theories as to the origins of those identities, and as a result, the party polarity which emerged in this period. So to put this in the language of party systems, we just see a complete shock to the party system, which reconfigures the party system and gives birth to new political cleavages, new groupings, new alignments between representatives. And what we'll see in the next section is how we go from fuzzier understandings of political parties. The debate still goes on about whether these Tories actually existed as a grouping or whether we should use separate but slightly more confusing labels for them. Or whether they were political parties. And then we come to something where actually these parties are much more self-identifiable political parties, especially on the Tory side. Although they seem limited now, the changes in the electorate following the Great Reform Act created an electoral dispensation that was sufficiently different from the old system to raise serious concerns about the political future prospects of the Tory party of Pitt and Liverpool. And that's according to Jenkins, 1999, page 62. But, obviously, the Conservative Party survived, and a lot of that is down to one man, Peel. Since the split and collapse of the Tories in 1830, a new phrase, that's the split between the Canningites and the ultra-Tories over the issue of Catholic emancipation, a new phrase was gaining ground to describe the party, conservative. And this was used amongst the more liberal Canningites rather than the ultra-Tories. Peel himself used the phrase conservative in January 1833, immediately after the 1832 general election. Names matter, and for Jenkins, the difference was one of methodology as well as worldview. Whereas the former title of Tory conveyed the idea of an monopolies enjoyed by institutions connected to the Anglican landed elite, the latter, Conservatives, allowed for the possibility of gradual, cautious change designed to reconcile those institutions with the prevailing attitudes in the modern world. Conservatism, in fact, represented an extension of the liberal Tory reformist impulse up to the 1820s, seen with Peel's establishment of the police force and other kind of key Tory figures. Or this can be summed up in Edmund Burke's phrase, change in order to conserve. So essentially, the Tories' kind of understanding in this rebranding were staunch defenders of established tradition and privilege, or privileges, and were unbending, unyielding in that defence. Whereas the Conservatives would be more flexible, and they would resist change for change's sake, and they would resist grand experiments in governance. But where there was a genuine need to change, such as with the Reform Act to expand the franchise, they would engage with that process in an attempt to shape it, acceptable to them. So this involved working with the Whigs to defeat more radical reforms, for instance. So Burke said, change in order to conserve. For Simon Jenkins, Peel, more than any leader, took an essentially reactionary parliamentary interest, Toryism, and made it fit eventually to govern a modern nation state. Even now, however, we do not have official leaders of the opposition. According to Jenkins, given the constitutional practice that the power to appoint the Prime Minister still rested with the King, for this reason it would have been improper for a political party to restrict the King's by electing its own leader in opposition. Thus, until he was made PM in 1834, Peel was merely the most conspicuous member of the opposition in the Commons, and it was only when he was commissioned by the King to form a government in December 1834 that he truly became leader of the Conservative Party. At least that's according to T.A. Jenkins. Other people might differ. King William IV's decision to dismiss the Whig government and to invite Peel to form a government ruined Peel's plans to let the Whig administration collapse on its own. The inclusion of the Duke of Wellington, seen as an old-school reactionary Tory, in Peel's government as Foreign Secretary, also throwing their lot in with Peel and Peel's Conservatives. Thus, Peel's desire to form a broad-based government was ruined, and he was forced to rely solely on Conservative Party MPs. And we can see why this might be cohesive, because the Whigs know that they wouldn't defect to the Conservatives based on ideology, and the Conservatives know that if they defect to the Whigs, they will be out of government, or they'll be out of office. And so you begin to get this structure. Strangely, upon taking ministerial office back then, politicians had to be re-elected by their constituents, a practice which only ended in 1920. Peel wanted to convince the population that his government was different to the pre-reformed Tory party, and so he issued the Tamworth Manifesto, ostensibly to his electors, but the document was approved by the Cabinet and sent to the leading London newspapers for publication. The Tamworth Manifesto is seen to have been a first at stating conservative principles. It said the government would accept reform of 1832 as irrevocable, and it would reform abuses within the political and ecclesiastical system. It would balance the interests of landed interests and trade and industry, and it would have its own moderate reforming intentions. You can get this in Jenkins 1999 or Webb 2019. This was a slow, steady reform in the Conservative tradition that we would recognise today, and the values of the Tamworth Manifesto still speak to the heart of the modern Conservative Party. The Peel government fell quickly. It had just 175 seats out in a 658-seat Commons, but in the general election of 1835, Peel gained nearly 100 seats. Peel continued his strategy of governing in opposition. He would permit acceptable reforms to be carried, whilst helping the Whigs to resist unwelcome pressures from their allies, the Irish nationalists and radicals, if they were proposing reforms that Peel thought went too far. Now, fortunes were on the up, and between 1833 and 1837, 31 MPs who supported the Reform Act joined the Conservatives. Another 17 joined in the 4 years between 1837 and 41. Without a doubt, Peel's assurance that the Reform Act was safe with the Conservatives made it possible for dissatisfied Whigs to jump ship. Peel managed to defeat the Whig government on a budget issue of removing tariffs from sugar coming from outside the empire, which led to a confidence motion, which the Whig government lost by 1 vote. As Jenkins notes, protectionism served as a perfect unifying cause for the Conservatives. After the Whigs obligingly pushed it to the forefront of political debate, it would later become clear the fundamental differences of opinion existed between Peel and the majority of the Conservative Party, and this will come to the fore under the Corn Laws, which the enthusiasm and excitement of 1841 had only temporarily concealed. 1841 being when the Conservatives under Peel won the election with 52% of the votes and 58% of the seats. Now, this was an important date, according to Clarke, because the Queen at the time supported the Liberals in that general election, but they lost. Peel took office with a purely Conservative ministry. So, in 1841, what we get is a party ministry for the first time being displaced as the result of losing its majority and being replaced with a new party ministry. This set a pattern which was quickly accepted as the norm. Even so, it was not the only possible outcome. Well into the 19th century, it was not uncommon for a ministry to collapse, like Walpole's, but because its majority had been eroded during the course of a session. So Gladstone resigned for such reasons in 1873 and 1885. But we get the establishment of the concept of alternative party governments. Overall, Clarke argues that the 1830s was the crucial decade even, for the modern British party system. He argues parties completed their conquest of the House of Commons and became accepted as the organisation whose relative strength should determine the complexion of government, not the Crown. From 1835 to 1845, there were obviously 2 parties in the Commons, and only 2. They each sought to form the government as a party by totally ousting the other, and they expected to do so by winning a majority at a general election. It was the identification of parties with both government and opposition, interchangeably, which marked the emergence of a modern aspect of party government in the 1830s. Clarke, 1980, page 234 to 235. For Jenkins, the party built up by Peel in opposition was not so much a new political entity, despite the widespread adaptation of the word Conservative, as the resurrection, in a more perfectly developed form, of the Tory party of professional administrators and country gentlemen of Liverpool's day. The party also built up stronger organisational operations. In 1832, the Carlton Club was founded to act as the party's headquarters, and after the 1835 general election, Francis Bonham effectively became the party's first full-time election agent. Constituency organisation also improved, given requirements for register of electors to be maintained, so Conservative associations began to form to ensure their supporters were on the roll and to challenge the eligibility of known opponents. The Conservative Party shared a similar base of support to the Tories, and the issue of protectionism helped unite landowners and farmers too. The editor of the Quarterly Review proclaimed in 1841 that "'tis the first time that I remember in our history that the people have chosen the first minister for the sovereign." It's somewhat ironic that it was Peel who achieved this, for Peel disliked party politics and believed the Crown should be free to choose ministers. Instead, his victory at the head of the Conservatives in 1841 forced the Queen to choose a Prime Minister she did not want, to form a ministry she did not support. It was the Conservative Party who truly challenged the constitution in the most unconservative of ways. Either way, party politics had truly arrived. Peel's government was pro-free trade. As Douglas notes, his 1842 budget swept away literally hundreds of indirect taxes and reintroduced income tax as an alternative source of revenue. Income tax in the 19th century and well into the 20th was paid exclusively by people in comparatively comfortable circumstances. The budget fitted well with Peel's vision of conservatism. Not only was he unwilling to resist change when it was palpably inevitable, he was willing to bring change about when there were evident merits in doing so. By the early 1840s, it looked very much as if Peel's general vision of the political future had been achieved. Yet, events would soon prove otherwise. That's Douglas 2005, page 6. Robert Peel's government fell in 1846 over the issue of repealing the Corn Laws. Now, the Corn Laws protected domestic produce from imported grain. They were essentially an import tariff. This benefited landowners and farmers within the country, but it made food more expensive to the detriment of manufacturers and workers. Peel and most of his cabinet were in favour of repeal of the Corn Laws. They were free traders. But a large segment of the Conservative Party, who typically represented farming and landing interests, were not. They were protectionists. A majority of his own MPs voted against him, and later that month, a group of Conservative MPs joined the opposition to bring down Peel's government. You can read about that in Gash 2020. The Conservatives would be out of power for most of the next 30 years. The party remained protectionist, while those who supported Peel's free trade instincts formed a Peelite group in Parliament. And this was a group, it was not a party. Peel refused to even try to form a party. So the bulk of free trade Conservatives received no lead from Peel, each being left to determine his own individual course. In the 1847 general election, they represented around one-third of the Conservative Party, but their numbers dwindled after Peel's death in 1850. Many drifted back into the Conservative Party, but eventually the bulk of Peelites joined with the Whigs and the Radicals to form the Liberal Party in 1859, where they were more at home with their free trade instincts. The Conservatives formed a series of minority governments under Lord Derby, but they would not win an election again until 1874 under Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli modernised the organisation of the Conservative Party. Conservative Central Office, a professional organisation established by Disraeli in 1870, and the newly formed National Union, which drew together local voluntary associations, gave the party additional unity and strength. Disraeli also sought to combat the rise of socialism by emphasising social reform to reduce the enormous disparity in the living conditions of the rich and poor. Again, this change in order to conserve conservative mantra, and they combined a strong activist imperial and foreign policy which helped the party transcend class barriers. This is where we get the idea of one nation conservatism. Disraeli looked at kind of socialist or Marxist threats and revolutionary thought as a response to the poor conditions of the working class. Argued actually we are two nations, and that's where one nation gets its name from. The idea that policies should be aimed at reducing the poor options for individuals in the working class. The state should have some role in bringing their living standards up. Echoing Disraeli in 2019, Boris Johnson would promise to level up forgotten areas of the country and deliver the UK's chief foreign policy objective. So in many ways, history just repeats itself. Although Disraeli's contribution was to transform the party from one that spoke primarily for landed interests to one that could draw supporters from the middle class and from the newly enfranchised working class. Why was Disraeli forced into this? Well, the Reform Act of 1867, or the Representation of the People Act 1867, was some legislation that enfranchised part of the urban male working class in England and Wales for the first time. So Disraeli was responding to a huge new bulk of voters who he knew would either go to the Liberals or to various socialist or communist parties or whatever. And so he had to put forward a conservative vision for those people. However, in the 1868 general election, the party lost, but Disraeli done enough to secure the party's long-term health. The The government lost its majority in the 1880 general election, and it was not until the election of 1886, where the Liberal Party had split over the issue of Irish Home Rule, that the Conservative Party had a solid majority since the Corn Laws. Similarly, the 1886 general election was the first since under Peel in 1841, where the party won a plurality or majority of the popular vote. It did this through an alliance with Liberal Unionists, former members of the Liberal Party who had left the Liberals over their opposition to Irish Home Rule, led by Joseph Chamberlain. The Liberal Unionist Party entered an alliance with the Conservative Party in a 10-year coalition, but remained separate political organisations until a formal merger in 1912. And thus we have the Conservative Party in its current form. Okay, so this is section 4. We have looked at the emergence of the Conservative Party very briefly, it has to be said. And if you are interested in that, there are a huge range of books that look at the history of the Conservative Party that will typically start with Peel. So if that is something you're interested in, you know, something like The Conservatives, A History by Harris would be a good place to start. But if you're not interested in it, just a broad awareness of the historical evolution and some of the strands within the Conservative Party will do you well. But now we're going to talk about the Whigs, who became the Liberals. Now, the Whigs became a more cohesive grouping during the 1830s, based on their platform of parliamentary reform and abolition of slavery throughout the empire. Now, the Reform Act of 1832 saw the mainly aristocratic Whigs joined in the Commons by increasing numbers of middle-class members and by a smaller number of radicals, a loose grouping of MPs who sought further parliamentary reform, lower taxes and freer trade. From about 1850, they tended to work together in cooperation with the Peelites, who we spoke about earlier, and in 1859 they merged together, although Peel was not included himself, with the radicals to form the Liberal Party. In 1860, the Liberal Registration Association was set up. This was a key element of the party's organisation on the ground. It helped to register and poll voters, provide candidates, financial assistance and establish constituency Liberal associations in places where none existed. You can read a lot about this in Douglas 2005. Hence, in the 19th century, the Whig and Tory parties had faded and were replaced by the Liberals and Conservatives. Like I mentioned earlier, I've presented a direct link between the Whigs and the Liberals and the Tories and the Conservatives, which is the usual approach to the history of party politics in Britain. But there was significant cross between the old parties, the pre-1832 Reform Act parties and the post-1832 Reform Act parties, when the dust had settled. For example, William Gladstone was a Tory and a Liberal, but he was never a Whig. On the other hand, the 14th Earl of Derby was a Whig, who then went on to lead 3 Conservative governments, but he was never in the Tory party. So, Douglas argues that the safest way to think about party origins is to consider that around 1830, the Whig and Tory parties both began to disintegrate, and it was not until the late 1860s that the Liberal and Conservative parties had fully come into existence in a fully recognisable form. The Liberals stood for balanced budgets, low taxes, laissez-faire, a moral tone to politics, and in general were against foreign entanglements or peace, economy and reform. And you can see this is kind of the opposite of what the Whigs were in favour of, especially under William of Orange and George I and II, which they were in favour of entanglements, especially with France, whereas it was the Tories who were more in favour of free trade and commerce and peace abroad. So as Douglas notes, although the Liberal Party was by no means the historic Whig Party under another name, the Liberal Party did inherit 2 important legacies from the Whigs. The first was the core idea of liberty, and the second was constitutional government. However, there were strong ideological differences within the party, within the Liberal Party, that foreshadowed eventual splits, specifically over Irish Home Rule and what it meant to be British. As Douglas notes, until the middle 1880s, Gladstone believed in the merits of the Union and sought to pacify Ireland and demands for Irish Home Rule within the fabric of the Union. However, the 1885 election, result shown in the picture, shows the success of the Irish Parliamentary Party in most of Ireland. Gladstone, who had supported national independence in Italy, Bulgaria, Afghanistan and the Sudan, saw that he couldn't keep Ireland from leaving the Union. So, when Gladstone introduced his plans to the Commons in 1886, the party was weakened by the defection of a group of MPs called the Liberal Unionists, who disliked Gladstone's plans for Home Rule and would eventually join the Conservatives. I mentioned them earlier. The Liberals also suffered with the death of Gladstone in 1893. The party lacked leadership. Their commitment to Home Rule was questioned by the fact they hadn't been able to get it passed yet, and they were divided on questions of imperialism. It was only when the Conservatives came out in favour of imperial preference, which is favourable tariffs for colonies, that the Liberals could once again unite around free trade. In the 1906 general election, the Liberals won 397 out of 670 seats. They increased their tally by 214. So being united was helpful, obviously. But in the First World War, the Liberals were ripped apart. The Liberal leader Asquith led a Liberal government until 1915, when he was forced into the coalition with Conservatives and Labour, although he was still the Prime Minister. However, Asquith was increasingly unpopular, and the lack of success in wartime performance, especially due to the Battle of the Somme, led to his replacement with the Liberal David Lloyd George. Now, he led a majority Conservative coalition, even though he himself was a Liberal. Chadwick notes how this split in 1916 between two outstanding figures of the Edwardian Liberal Party, Asquith and Lloyd George, tore liberalism apart. It deprived it of the opportunity to mount a serious appeal to the newly expanded electorate after 1918. Those who supported Asquith went to the opposition benches, so you had Liberals participating in and supporting the government, and also Liberals opposing the government under two different leaders. Aligned with Asquith were those who felt that cherished Liberal beliefs were being threatened by wartime exactions such as military conscription, introduced in 1916. Allied to Lloyd George were those who sided with the Conservatives in seeking a more rigorous prosecution of the war. You can find more about this in Chadwick 2000. Following the end of the war, the 1918 general election was what we call a coupon election. Liberal, Conservative and Labour candidates who supported the national government, the national wartime government, were given coupons to show that they were supported by the government and they benefited from the patriotic vote. In many cases, those who were not given a coupon were seen to be anti-British, and they were harmed massively. Lloyd George's Liberals ran unopposed by the Conservatives, and the coalition parties won in a landslide. The Conservatives won enough seats to govern alone, but with the coalition Liberals and others, they won 520 out of 707 seats. Asquith's Liberals faced Conservative and Labour opponents, and they were routed. They won just 36 seats, down from about 236. The Liberals never really recovered from this split, and Labour became the main opposition party. As Webb notes, the party's internal conflicts exacted a terrible toll on it at precisely the time when the Labour Party was emerging as a coherent and an effective source of reform in the country. Indeed, when the Labour government failed to deal with the Great Depression and a national government was formed in about 1931, the Liberals were split once again, and there's not that many of them to be split at this point. This time over whether to support tariffs to help get the country out of a budget deficit. The party was divided between Sir John Simon's Liberal national supporters of the Conservative-dominated national government, where Sir Herbert Samuel's opposition Liberals and a small number of independent Liberals who still clung to the ageing Lloyd George were opposed to the tariffs. The National Liberals eventually merged into the Conservative Party in 1968. So you have an almost ridiculous situation where the Liberals were split into three, and in a first-past-the-post system, that is absolutely deadly. It might be different under PR, but here is absolutely deadly. By the 1935 general election, the Liberals were in opposition again and held just 21 seats, 3.4% of the total, and they were done by the 1945 general election. Okay, now we fast forward to the 1980s, and we come to the final stage of the story of the Liberals, which is the formation of the Liberal Democrats. So the Liberal Party had been on an upward trajectory, achieving a breakthrough in the February 1974 general election, where they won 19% of the vote, but due to the electoral system, they won just 2% of the seats. They faced a setback in 1979, winning 14% of the vote, but they were clearly out of extinction territory. By 1983, however, they would just be 2 percentage points short of Labour. How? Well, Following Labour's 1979 election defeat, the party looked like it was lurching to the left. Mandatory reselection of MPs was passed by the Labour conference. The party elected left-wing Michael Foot as their leader, and the very left-wing Tony Benn came within a whisker of winning the deputy leadership. The Labour Party was also becoming much more Eurosceptic, which alarmed the kind of right of the party who were pro-EEC, the European Economic Community. This mirrored concern over the direction of the Conservative Party under Thatcher as well. Economic indicators were bad, and before the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands, the government was pretty unpopular. So both Labour and the Conservatives were losing support to the Liberals. Key figures from within the Labour Party, such as Roy Jenkins, who was the former deputy leader and former Home Secretary, and others, were concerned about this. And they argued that actually there was space within politics for a new party on the kind of centre-left that rejected Labour's lurch to the left. And in March 1981, the Social Democratic Party was launched. Its membership eventually boasted 28 Labour MPs and 1 Conservative. And the party received positive media coverage and was generally seen as a breath of fresh air in politics. Now, the Liberals had a dilemma here. Should they strangle the party at birth, as Cyril Smith suggested, or should they cooperate to weaken the Labour Party further? There was also a clash in political culture between the two groups. The SDP was much more elitist, centralised than the Liberals, but electoral expediency won out because of the kind of ravages of first past the post. And in June 1981, an agreement was made and the SDP-Liberal alliance was formed. Now, the alliance was doing very well in the opinion polls. Mori public opinion polls for the last quarter of 1981 and the first quarter of 1982 showed intending alliance votes running ahead of intending voters for either of the other two parties. At one point, the alliance was on 51% in polls, which is absolutely bonkers. However, the Falklands invasion happened, the media lost interest in the alliance, and Thatcher was able to ride a patriotic wave of support. Now, this mainly came, at least the Conservatives' rise in the polls came at the expense of the alliance. So in the 1983 general election, the Conservatives won in a landslide. But for the first time, all seats in Great Britain were contested by the main three parties, and the alliance came within 700,000 votes of Labour, just 2 percentage points difference. However, because of the disproportionality of the electoral system, the alliance only won about 30 seats to Labour's roughly 200 seats. The parties, however, the SDP and the Liberal Party, remained separate for the 1987 general election, but in March 1988, the two parties merged into the Social and Liberal Democrats, later renamed the Liberal Democrats. Some unhappy folk persisted in the SDP and the Liberal Party as separate organisations, but these have not really achieved any measure of electoral success outside of a few council areas. So, for example, the Liberal Party have a few seats on Liverpool City Council representing the Tuebrook area. After merging with the SDP in the 1990s, the Liberals, or now the Liberal Democrats, abandoned the traditional Liberal idea of equidistance. This is that the Liberal Party is equally different to the Labour and Conservative Party. Now the party is positioning itself on the left of centre and mainly anti-conservative, although in different parts of the country this balance is emphasised to different extents. This left of centre positioning, though, does outline why going into coalition with the Conservatives was just so damaging for the Liberal Democrats. The impact on the Labour Party was important too. The appearance of success for the SDP as part of the alliance sharpened minds within the Labour Party, and the left wing of the party faced an alliance of the centre and soft left of Labour. The left-wing candidate Tony Benn failed in his bid to become the party's deputy leader again. 5 left-wingers failed to be re-elected to the party's National Executive Committee, the party's governing body, and the left lost the party treasurership. And it became much more fashionable to think the future of the Labour Party was in the centre-left rather than the left wing. There's a lot of information about this as well in Thorpe 1997. The Labour Party was formed as a defensive body to protect trade unions, and after World War II cemented its place as the second party in British politics with a landslide election victory. However, by 1951 the party was back in opposition and, assuming the next election is in 2022, since 1945 Labour will have only been in office for 38% of the time. The organisation we know today as the Labour Party was formed in 1900 as the Labour Representation Committee. Organisations to represent working class interests did exist previously. Some local Liberal parties put forward Liberal Labour or Lib Lab candidates who were financially supported by trade unions and sought to represent the working class, but were supporters of the Liberal Party generally, and this was typically in mining areas. The Independent Labour Party was another vehicle for working class representation and sought to bring together socialists and trade unionists as well as middle class sympathisers. However, in 1895 the ILP lost its seats, leaving Lib Labbers being parliamentary representatives of the working class. The Labour Representation Committee aimed to bring together various existing left-wing groups and to establish a distinct Labour group in Parliament who shall have their own whips and agree upon their own policy. Now you can read a lot more about this in Thorpe 1997. But the LRC was not born out of a class uprising or revolution. It was a deliberate move by the trade union movement to protect their own legal position in face of an increasingly uncertain legal landscape within a broader capitalist framework. Indeed, at the founding of the LRC, the conference rejected a motion to base the party upon class war. It did not commit itself to any other form of socialism either. At the formation of the LRC, only 13% of those who could be members of a union were, and of that 13%, only 17.4% were affiliated to the LRC. The LRC was no juggernaut, and there was no guarantee to be successful or that it would last. Although Labour often calls itself a socialist party, it's worth noting that the trade unions were the main body behind the party. Socialists played a secondary role, with more left-wing elements within the party treated with suspicion by the party leadership and the unions. Indeed, some socialists saw trade unions as restrictive organisations of skilled workers which were only out for their own members, not the working class as a whole, whilst trade unions often saw socialists as intellectual romantics whose policy proposals would not be appealing to the existing working class in their real everyday today life. In the early days, the LRC was kept together by opposition to trade union policy, i.e. the government's trade union policy. So following the 1901 Taft Vale case, unions became liable for losses during strikes, which effectively outlawed strikes, and opposition to Chamberlain's protectionism. Labour and the working class backed free trade because it led to lower food prices and thus higher living standards or material standards for the working class. This had the effect of pushing the Labour and Liberal parties together. The Liberals were struggling at this point, and the Labour knew the three-way fight between Labour, Liberals and Conservatives could split the progressive vote and let the Conservatives in. Ramsay MacDonald, Labour leader, and Herbert Gladstone, Liberal chief whip, met in secret and agreed that in a number of constituencies the Liberals would stand aside for Labour. For Chadwick, the pact secretly cemented what quickly became one of the defining features of Edwardian politics, the progressive alliance between Liberalism and Labour. The 1906 general election was mainly fought on the issue of free trade, which pitted Labour and the Liberals against the Conservatives. Labour's manifesto made no mention of socialism. The LRC fielded 50 candidates, and another 5 were put forward by the Scottish Workers' Representation Committee, and most of these were concentrated in northern industrial England, Labour's areas of strength. Of those 50 candidates, 29 won, alongside 400 Liberal MPs. So, while Labour had made a breakthrough, it could not claim to be a national party because of the limited geographic spread of its MPs, and it's unclear just how much success it would have had without the Liberal Pact. Liberals were still the dominant partner in the progressive. The Labour Party was boosted in 1909 when the Miners' Union decided to join the party. At this point, this meant that 88% of the Trade Union Congress was affiliated with the Labour Party, and it also meant that 13 Lib Lab MPs defected to take the Labour whip. Despite this, Labour was in a bad position going into the 1910 election. A court case, which was ironically brought by a trade unionist, no less, led to a decision that union contributions to political parties was illegal. Labour lost its main funding stream, and so many local Labour parties collapsed, and Labour candidates at the 1910 election were often desperately short of money. The two general elections in 1910 saw the Labour Party remain stagnant. In January, the party increased its number of MPs to 40. In December, they gained 2 more seats, but a lower percentage of the vote. But the Liberal government enacted 2 pieces of legislation beneficial to Labour. In 1911, a salary of £400 for MPs was introduced. In 1913, the Trade Union Act allowed for unions to create a political levy, which members could contract out of if desired. As Thorpe notes, there was little else that the political fund money could be spent on except the Labour Party, giving the latter a firmer base of income and budgeting than ever before. Now, Labour ended World War I in a much better position than it started. In 1914, the party was weak organisationally, a second-ranked partner in the Progressive Alliance, with no distinctive policy proposals and unable to stand enough candidates across the country to form a government. By 1918, participation in the wartime coalition government had shown it was a serious party and it could be trusted. Trade union membership had rapidly expanded and work had been done on the party's organisation. Labour had a very good war. Now, if you're interested in this in more detail, Thorpe is a really great source for you to go to. The 1918 general election was a disappointment for Labour. The Labour-Liberal electoral pact was over. Clause 4 of the Labour Party's 1918 constitution called for the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, which put a stark dividing line between Labour and the Liberals. Labour only managed 57 on 21% of the vote, a disappointment compared to expectations. However, a silver lining was detected. Many of Labour's old guard were defeated, which allowed for a new generation to take over. Labour seriously improved their position come the 1922 general election. As the coalition became increasingly illiberal, especially in the continuity of tariffs, and Lloyd George failed to fulfil the promise of social reform made in the 1918 campaign, it was Labour, not the Liberal Party, which could claim the mantle of radical politics and thus benefit from gaining anti-conservative votes. 1922 election saw Labour win 29% of the vote, up 9 percentage points, and emerge as the main opposition party. The 1923 election was called to give Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin a mandate to back protectionism over free trade, and, as a result, he lost around 100 seats. But the Conservatives remained the largest party. The Liberals, who had reunited in defence of free trade, emerged with 159 members, but Labour won 191 seats, up 49 on their performance a year previously, and so were the official opposition party. Now, this increase was due to the effects of first past the post, not a massive increase in many more seats on just 1 percentage point of the vote. Labour leader Ramsay MacDonald was called to form a minority Labour government. He used this as a chance to show that Labour was fit to govern. This meant, for MacDonald, no radical policies which would alienate voters, which disappointed those on the left, and no coalition with the Liberals. The Liberals were too poor for another election anyway, so could be counted on to support the government. Labour's first experience in government showed that it could govern, but it exposed the weakness in the policy offering of the party. The government did not last long either. Labour next entered office in 1929 with a strong party machine, a stronger policy platform and a more effective leadership. It was the first time Labour would win the most seats. The Liberals promised to support the government yet again. The second MacDonald government was a disaster. The Wall Street crash tanked the economy and sent unemployment skyrocketing. The Labour Party had little to offer due to, and this is from Thorpe and Chadwick, the inadequacy of its economic ideas. While the Liberals had adopted the Keynesian demand management as part of their redefinition of party policy at this stage, Labour's economic policy continued to be dominated by Chancellor of the Exchequer Snowdon's desire to balance the budget, to make capitalism more dynamic and prosperous in order to pave the way for socialism. In an interesting twist of history, attempts to introduce elements of Keynesian economics which would come to dominate Labour's post-war economic offering, in an attempt to introduce into the Labour Party, was spearheaded by Oswald Mosley, who at this time was in the Labour Party, but would later go on to head the British Union of Fascists. So that's quite the glow-up. Unemployment rose, budget deficit grew, and still Labour stuck to a policy of free trade and adherence to the gold standard, which is saw as essential guarantors of cooperation and trade with other countries. Attempts to balance the budget with cuts, including 10% cut in unemployment benefit, was rejected by the Trade Union Congress and the Cabinet. MacDonald went to the King and formed a national government with a cabinet of 4 national Labourites, 4 Conservatives and 2 Liberals. MacDonald's National Labour group consisted of just 13 MPs, and defections from the actual Labour Party were few. No constituency parties or trade unions joined, and few local members did. However, the national government passed the necessary legislation and geared up for a general election. Combined, the national government candidates won 90% of the seats on 67% of the vote. The Labour Party was decimated. They'd lost 2 million votes, nearly 8 percentage points in the vote share, and lost 241 seats. Not to be outdone, though, the Liberals were also split, now into 3 groups. Within the national government, there was the Liberal Party, who opposed protectionism, the National Liberals, who supported the government and who would support protectionism if necessary, also within the National Government Coalition, and the Independent Liberals, who were led by David Lloyd George, who opposed the government and supported free trade. The Liberals rapidly, unsurprisingly, became an irrelevance. Thorpe describes the 1930s as a decade of disappointment for Labour. The 1935 election, the last before World War II, saw another Conservative majority, but Labour did triple their number of seats to 154. Now, in 1934, Labour adopted a new party programme based on Keynesianism and inspired by Roosevelt's New Deal. A mixed economy, including nationalisation of limited sectors, fuel and power, water, transport, agriculture, iron and steel, shipbuilding, engineering, textiles, banking and insurance, as well as state planning of investments and what became known as the Morrisonian method of public ownership. The Morrisonian model. It also called for the setting up of a National Investment Board to plan investment and industrial development. Now, this firmly planted Labour as a statist party that was willing to use the power of the state to shape the economy. It saw the state as the only agent in the transformation to and administration of a socialist society. For Labour then, largely as it is today, a plan would be drawn up in London and implemented from London, with perhaps a nod to local areas. It would take into account regional differences and hence regional policy, defined at the centre, implemented through Westminster and Whitehall, with local government coming in only as an agent of central government. Industries would be nationalised to be run by boards appointed by the Minister in London, meeting in London. This was not a socialism of worker participation in governing bodies, but rather a socialism of the state. Worker participation was sacrificed for ministerial fiat. And this is partly why the UK's centralising tendencies that we see today with the COVID response are so strong, because both the Conservatives and the Labour Party bought into centralising power at Westminster, despite the fact that the Conservatives are meant to be all for individual liberty and freedom, and Labour are meant to be for empowering workers. In reality, both see the state as the main method of enacting or understanding political control. Just like with the First World War, Labour had a good Second World War. As Thorpe notes, it undoubtedly speeded the party's opportunity of competing with the Conservatives on equal or even superior terms. In 1939, Labour looked like losing yet another general election, probably by quite a large margin. 6 years later, it was to win what remains its greatest electoral victory. Labour was overrepresented in Churchill's wartime coalition in order to ensure trade union cooperation with the war effort. Within the coalition, Labour leader Clement Attlee proceeded to develop the central themes of what had been termed war socialism: public provision in the field of housing, health, education, food, as well as the use of the state in directing the production of goods. As with World War I, Labour benefited from gaining credibility as a governing party and gained valuable experience, and saw an increase in trade union membership and an increased involvement in trade unions within government decision making. As union prestige grew, Labour benefited from its association with it. The Labour Party also benefited from its association with the Beveridge Report, written by Liberal economist William Beveridge. It would form the basis of a universal welfare state and would tackle the 5 giants of want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness. So Conservatives were sceptical, and the wartime government came to a compromise whereby the government would make no commitment for or against legislation on the basis of the report. However, 97 Labour MPs voted against the government lines and cemented the link with the report in the mind of the public. In the 1945 general election, Labour was seen as the party most likely to report into policy, and the public were crying out for social reform. Labour won the 1945 general election handsomely, 48% of the vote, 61% of the seat, and there was no region of the UK that did not have a Labour MP. However, there was no mass radicalisation of the population. Labour did do well amongst the working class, but they also polled well amongst the middle class voters, some of whom saw personal opportunities in a new enlarged state. For the first time, first-time voters had grown up in the aftermath of World War I, where the promises of Liberal David Lloyd George were restricted by Conservative MPs who kept him in office. Voters did not want a repeat of that. Trade unions had helped the fight at home, and the socialist USSR had helped the fight abroad. Socialism was not seen as dangerous as it had been in the past. Labour's adoption of Keynesianism and support for the Beveridge Report gave it a more appealing political economy than the McDonaldite free market economics of the pre-war era. And whilst voters might not have become socialist, they did want reform and a more expansive welfare system, both areas where Labour was seen as much more credible and likely to deliver than the Conservatives. For Thorpe, as with the First World War, it was something of a paradox that Labour, which had always argued that peace was the essential prerequisite of progress, should have done so well out of a long and bloody war. So the journey from the birth of Labour in 1900 to Labour's post-war victory in 1945 was not linear, and it was not smooth. Labour's eventual success was not wholly down to their own doing, nor were they completely at the mercy of events or other actors. There was no guarantee the party would succeed. A poor performance in 1906 might have seen the LRC become just another failed left-wing movement which retreated into obscurity. But splits, Liberals certainly helped the Labour Party. And there are two broad theories of Labour's success in the pre-war period. The first is what's known as the Progressive Alliance thesis. In this understanding, the Liberal Party, in allowing the Labour Party to stand in seats unchallenged, let the Labour Party establish itself as a parliamentary player ready to capitalise on the Liberal split in 1916 and thus take up the mantle of progressive alternative to the Tories. The other theory, however, argues that Labour benefited from a rise of new working class political consciousness based on the ideas and values of Labourism rather than socialism, and a gradual recognition amongst trade unionists and later voters that the interests of the workers would be better served by Labour than the Liberals. The argument here is that the restrictive electoral franchise hampered Labour's Labour's growth, and it was only the Reform Act of 1918 which enfranchised all adult men and the majority of women over the age of 30. These new voters split between the Conservative and Labour parties, not the Liberal Party. But the truth is probably somewhere in between. Undoubtedly, many people who wanted to vote Labour could not until the franchise was extended. Similarly, Labour did position itself on the side of the working class more explicitly than the Liberals, but it was not until Clause 4 that Labour had a party platform, and even then its policies still had much in common with its main progressive rival. But still, until the Liberals split, Labour had been unable to push itself forward as the leading voice in the Progressive Alliance. Without the Liberal split, there was no guarantee the party would ever escape that trap, or escape it so fully as it did in 1945. Labour also benefited from consistent trade union funding and the Conservative shift towards protectionism, as well as participation in both wartime governments. The party that emerged from World War II is the same that we see today. The only other point of interest was the defection of the SDP members, which we covered in the Liberal section of the lecture. So, there we are. There was nothing inevitable about Labour displacing the Liberals in the pre-war era. There was nothing inevitable about Labour's success in 1945, and there's nothing to say the Labour Party or the Conservative Party has to survive. It was saved in 1983 by the electoral system, and it was saved in the pre-war era by the Liberal split.